Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to rise to the very top of power? To have millions of people follow your every command, to have armies at your disposal, to walk into a room and have every single head turn in your direction. Imagine ruling a country. Imagine making decisions that reshape history. Imagine being so powerful that your name alone made people tremble. And then imagine this. One day you wake up and the walls are closing in. The same people who once cheered your name are now calling for your blood. The power that protected you for decades has become the very thing that sealed your fate. What does it feel like to go from commanding nations to standing alone in a small room, waiting for your final moments? Today, we're going to find out. Throughout history, the most powerful leaders on Earth, presidents, prime ministers, generals, dictators, have faced the ultimate reckoning. Some were tried in courts. Some were dragged before military tribunals. Some never even got a proper trial at all. But they all ended the same way. Power, then the fall, then execution. And here's the thing that makes these stories so haunting. These weren't random people. These were men who commanded entire armies, men who shaped the fate of millions, men who, at the height of their rule, probably believed they were untouchable. Some were war criminals who absolutely deserved what came to them. Others, well, others leave a far more complicated legacy. And a few of these cases, they still spark debate to this very day. So stay with me, because some of these stories are going to shock you. Some of them are going to make you angry, and a few of them might just make you feel something you didn't expect. These are 10 leaders who went from absolute authority to execution row. Let's get into it. Number 1. Saddam Hussein, Iraq, 2006. On the surface, he was one of the most feared men on the planet. For over 2 decades, Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq with an iron grip. His face was on murals on every street corner. His voice was on every television screen. You didn't criticize Saddam in Iraq. You didn't even whisper about it. Because if you did, you disappeared. Saddam rose to power through the Ba'ath Party, a political movement that blended Arab nationalism with an authoritarian model of governance. By 1979, he had consolidated total control, purging rivals, silencing dissent, building a security apparatus so vast and so brutal that ordinary Iraqis lived in a state of permanent, low-grade fear. And yet, to many in the Arab world, he was a symbol, a strong man who stood up to Western powers, a leader who modernized Iraq's infrastructure, expanded literacy, and built one of the most developed nations in the Middle East. But here's where things start to shift. Because behind the development and the nationalism was something far darker. Saddam ordered chemical weapons attacks on Kurdish civilians in Halabja in 1988, an atrocity that killed thousands of people, including women and children. He launched a devastating war against Iran that lasted 8 brutal years. He invaded Kuwait in 1990, triggering the Gulf War. And through all of it, he survived. That's the thing about Saddam. He survived everything. Assassination attempts, wars, international sanctions. He had an almost supernatural ability to endure. Until 2003, the United States invasion of Iraq changed everything. Coalition forces swept into Baghdad with overwhelming military force. Saddam's regime crumbled within weeks, and Saddam himself vanished. For months, the most wanted man in the world was nowhere to be found. And then, in December 2003, American soldiers discovered him hiding in a small underground hole, a pit roughly 8 feet deep, near a farmhouse in Ad-Daur, just outside Tikrit. The man who had once commanded a 1 million-strong army was found alone, disheveled, with a long beard and a pistol he never fired. He surrendered without a fight. The trial that followed was chaotic, dramatic, and deeply controversial. Saddam appeared defiant throughout. He challenged the legitimacy of the court. He argued that the invasion of Iraq itself was illegal. He refused to bow. But the verdict was inevitable. On November 5, 2006, Saddam Hussein was found guilty of crimes against humanity for the massacre of 148 Shia men and boys in the town of Dujail, in retaliation for an assassination attempt in 1982. He was sentenced to death. The execution happened on December 30th, 2006, the first day of Eid al-Adha, one of the most sacred holidays in Islam. The timing was controversial on its own, but what happened inside that execution chamber made it even more so. Saddam was led into the room by guards, and in the final moments before the trapdoor opened, taunting could be heard. Men chanting the name of Muqtada al-Sadr, a Shia cleric and political rival. Saddam responded with defiance. He reportedly recited a prayer, then said, "Is this how real men act?" And then it was over. A mobile phone video of the execution leaked almost immediately, spreading across the internet within hours. The world was watching. Even today, people still debate whether justice was truly served that morning, or whether Saddam Hussein was executed in a way that was more about revenge than rule of law. What do you think? Number 2. Nicolae Ceaușescu, Romania, 1989. We are staying in power for a moment longer because the next story moves fast, very fast. If there's one execution on this list that feels like it came out of nowhere, like the floor simply opened up beneath someone's feet, it's the story of Nicolae Ceaușescu. For 24 years, Ceaușescu ruled Romania as one of Eastern Europe's most repressive communist dictators. But he was clever. Unlike his Soviet counterparts, he cultivated a kind of independent image. He criticized the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. He opened trade with Western nations, and he developed a cult of personality so extreme that he was referred to in state media as the genius of the Carpathians. Schools taught children to worship him. Poets wrote odes to him. The Romanian media portrayed him as a near-divine figure. And meanwhile, his people were starving. His economic policies were catastrophic. Romania's foreign debt spiraled, and Ceaușescu's response was to export most of the country's food and resources to pay it off, leaving Romanian citizens standing in line for bread in freezing temperatures. His secret police, the Securitate, monitored citizens obsessively, creating a climate of paranoia and fear unlike almost anywhere else in the Eastern Bloc. But here's where things get interesting. In December 1989, the wave of revolutions sweeping Eastern Europe finally reached Romania. It started in Timișoara, protests, gunfire, deaths. And then it spread to Bucharest. On December 21, 1989, Ceaușescu stood on a balcony and attempted to address a large crowd that had been assembled to show loyalty. He began to speak, and the crowd booed him. You have to understand, this had never happened before. Not once in 24 years of absolute rule. The look on his face in that moment, captured on live national television, is one of the most startling images in modern history. He didn't know what to do. His world was falling apart in real time. Within hours, the revolution erupted. By December 22nd, Ceaușescu and his wife Elena had fled Bucharest by helicopter. They were captured the same day. What happened next is something no one expected. Rather than a formal trial lasting months or years, the Romanian military convened a rushed tribunal on Christmas Day, December 25, 1989. The trial lasted barely 2 hours. Ceaușescu refused to recognize the court's authority. He refused to answer questions. Elena reportedly told the judges, "I was a mother to you all." The verdict came swiftly. Both were sentenced to death. They were taken outside, stood against a wall, and executed by firing squad minutes after the verdict was announced. The footage was broadcast on Romanian television. In the span of 4 days, Romania went from a totalitarian dictatorship to this. From absolute power to a wall in a courtyard. Even today, historians debate whether what happened was justice or a chaotic, improvised execution designed to prevent Ceaușescu from ever being able to speak again about what he knew and who had helped him. Stay with me, because this gets even more intense. Number 3. Hideki Tojo, Japan, 1948. By 1941, General Hideki Tojo was arguably the most powerful man in Japan. He was Prime Minister, Minister of War, and held multiple other portfolios simultaneously. And it was under his leadership that Japan launched its most fateful decisions, including the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which brought the United States into World War II. Tojo was not a charismatic populist in the mold of Hitler or Mussolini. He was an administrator, methodical, cold, deeply devoted to the imperial ideology that viewed Japan as destined for dominance across Asia. He oversaw a war that caused enormous suffering, from the occupation of China to the treatment of prisoners of war to atrocities across the Pacific theater. But here's where things start to shift. As Allied forces began to close in and Japan's military situation became increasingly desperate, Tojo's position became untenable. In July 1944, following the fall of the Mariana Islands, Tojo resigned from all his positions. The tide had turned. By August 1945, Japan had surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When American troops arrived to arrest him, Tojo attempted suicide, shooting himself in the chest. He survived. American military doctors saved his life specifically so he could stand trial. Think about that for a moment. They kept him alive to face justice. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, often called the Tokyo Trials, began in 1946. Tojo sat in the dock alongside other Japanese military and political leaders. He was charged with war crimes and crimes against peace. Unlike some of his co-defendants, Tojo attempted to take full personal responsibility, hoping to shield the emperor from implication. He remained composed, methodical to the last. On November 12, 1948, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was hanged at Sugamo Prison on December 23, 1948. In Japan, the legacy of Tojo remains extraordinarily divisive. Some consider him a war criminal who led his nation into a catastrophic and devastating conflict. Others, particularly nationalists, view him as a patriot who served his country. He is enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine, which continues to create diplomatic tensions to this day. Even today, people still debate whether the Tokyo trials were justice or victor's justice. Number 4. Benito Mussolini, Italy, 1945. Here's a name that doesn't need much introduction. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, was the founder of fascism and the model that Adolf Hitler studied and emulated. He seized power in Italy in 1922, marching on Rome at the head of his black shirts, and for 2 decades ruled with a combination of theatrical spectacle and genuine brutality. Mussolini was magnetic, larger than life. He gave thundering speeches from balconies. He projected an image of strength and masculine dominance that captivated millions, not just in Italy, but across Europe and the world. He formed an alliance with Hitler. He invaded Ethiopia. He invaded Albania. He dragged Italy into World War II on the side of Nazi Germany. And then, everything he built started collapsing. Allied forces invaded Sicily in July 1943. The Italian war effort was in shambles. By late July, the fascist Grand Council, his own people, voted to remove him from power. King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested. But Mussolini wasn't finished. German forces rescued him in a dramatic commando raid, and Hitler installed him as the puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic in northern Italy, a rump state entirely dependent on German military support. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing. Allied forces were advancing rapidly through Italy. Mussolini attempted to flee, disguised, hidden in a German convoy heading toward Switzerland. He was recognized, captured by Italian communist partisans. What happened next is something no one expected. On April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's own death, Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were taken to the village of Giulino di Mezzegra on the shores of Lake Como. They were stood against a stone wall and shot. Their bodies were then transported to Milan, hung upside down by their feet at a gas station in the Piazzale Loreto, the same square where, months earlier, the bodies of Italian resistance fighters had been displayed by fascists. Crowds gathered, some threw flowers, some threw stones. It was a grim, chaotic, and deeply emotional end. Not a courtroom, not a formal trial, just a summary execution by the people who had suffered under him for 20 years. Do you think that was justice or revenge? Number 5. Jang Song-taek, North Korea, 2013. Now we're going somewhere where information is extremely limited. And what we do know is deeply disturbing. Jang Song-taek was not the leader of North Korea, but for a long time he was considered the second most powerful man in the country. He was the uncle by marriage of Kim Jong-un. He was a veteran party official who had served for decades under Kim Jong-il. When Kim Jong-un took over after his father's death in 2011, Jang was widely viewed as a key mentor, a stabilizing hand for the young, untested new leader. He appeared at Kim Jong-un's side at major state events. He was a fixture of North Korean power. And then, in December 2013, he vanished. No warning, no public rumor, just gone. And then the state media announcement came, blunt, brutal, and astonishing. North Korean state television announced that Jang Song-taek had been arrested and accused of treason, corruption, womanizing, drug use, and attempting to overthrow the state. He was shown on television, flanked by military guards, being physically dragged from a meeting. The trial, if you can call it that, lasted 1 day. he was executed almost immediately. And here's where the story gets darker still. Because multiple sources, including South Korean intelligence, reported that the execution method was not a conventional firing squad. Reports indicated that Jang Song-taek was executed with an anti-aircraft gun. Whether those specific reports are accurate remains contested. North Korea is one of the most closed societies on Earth, and verifying information is extraordinarily difficult. But what is not contested is this: Jang Song-taek was eliminated with breathtaking speed, publicly humiliated in the process, and his entire extended family network was reportedly purged alongside him. This was not just an execution, it was a message. It sent a signal to every single person in North Korea's elite that no level of loyalty, no family connection, no decades of service would protect you. Even today, the full truth of what happened inside Pyongyang in December 2013 remains shrouded in secrecy. And that, in its own way, is perhaps the most chilling thing of all.
Number 6. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Pakistan, 1979.
This next story is one that I think deserves more attention than it typically gets. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was, in many ways, Pakistan's most charismatic and consequential political leader. He founded the Pakistan People's Party in 1967. He became president, then prime minister. He was educated at Berkeley and Oxford. He was brilliant, eloquent, and deeply popular with ordinary Pakistanis, particularly the poor and working class. He also oversaw Pakistan's nuclear weapons program and played a pivotal role in the country's response to its catastrophic defeat in the 1971 war with India. By the mid-1970s, Bhutto had become a dominant force in South Asian politics. But here's where things start to shift. In the 1977 elections, Bhutto won, but the opposition accused him of massive electoral fraud. Protests erupted. The country was destabilized, and on July 5, 1977, General Zia-ul-Haq, Bhutto's own hand-picked chief of army staff, launched a military coup. Bhutto was arrested. He was put on trial for ordering the political murder of a rival politician, charges he vigorously denied. Many international observers, including heads of state, expressed serious concerns about whether the trial was fair. The verdict came in March 1979. Guilty. Sentenced to death. Appeals went to the highest courts. World leaders, from U.S. President Jimmy Carter to various heads of state across Asia, Africa, and Europe, sent personal appeals to General Zia, urging clemency. Zia refused. On April 4, 1979, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was hanged. He maintained his innocence to the end. His daughter, Benazir Bhutto, would later become prime minister twice and was herself assassinated in 2007. Even today, the case of Bhutto's execution is considered one of the most controversial judicial decisions in Pakistani history. Many Pakistanis, across generations, believe that a democratically elected leader was executed not because of a murder charge, but because he was a political threat to military rule. Was it justice, or was it a state-sanctioned elimination?
Number 7. Adnan Menderes, Turkey, 1961.
The story of Adnan Menderes is, in some ways, a cautionary tale about what happens when democracy and military power collide. Menderes served as Prime Minister of Turkey from 1950 to 1960. He was, notably, the first democratically elected Prime Minister to actually win power through free and fair elections in Turkey's modern history. Under his leadership, Turkey experienced significant economic development, rapid urbanization, and expanded its relationship with the Western world, including joining NATO. He was genuinely popular. Millions of Turks supported him. But here's where things start to shift. As his time and power extended, Menderes became increasingly authoritarian. He suppressed press freedom. He used state power against political opponents. Tensions with the military and secular establishment grew. On May 27, 1960, the Turkish military launched a coup. Menderes was arrested along with hundreds of politicians. The subsequent tribunal, the Yassıada trials, tried Menderes and others on charges including violating the constitution and inciting citizens against one another. The proceedings were deeply flawed by any objective legal standard. On September 17, 1961, Adnan Menderes was hanged on İmralı Island. Here's the painful postscript. In the years that followed, Turkish public opinion shifted dramatically. Menderes was gradually rehabilitated, seen not as a criminal, but as a martyr of democracy, someone who had been executed by a military that feared democratic rule. In 1990, his remains were reinterred in a state ceremony. He was honored with the title of martyr. And today, Adnan Menderes International Airport in Izmir is named after him. Even today, people debate whether the man hanged on İmralı Island was a corrupt authoritarian who deserved his fate, or a democratically elected leader who was murdered by a military that didn't want to be governed.
Number 8. Pierre Laval, France, 1945. Pierre Laval is, in every sense of the word, a collaborator. He served twice as Prime Minister of France, and during World War II, he became the chief political figure of the Vichy government, the French regime that collaborated with Nazi Germany following France's surrender in 1940. And Laval didn't just comply with German demands, he actively advanced them. He deported Jews to Nazi death camps. Approximately 75,000 Jewish people were deported from France to Auschwitz and other camps during the Vichy period. Laval negotiated and facilitated many of these deportations, including, infamously, the deportation of Jewish children, which was not even initially required by the Nazis. He made a speech in 1942 in which he said he wished for a German victory, a statement so stark it shocked even some of his collaborationist colleagues. But here's where it gets complicated. Laval claimed, to the end of his life, that he was playing a cynical political game, collaborating just enough to protect France from even harsher German occupation, that he was shielding his people, that the alternatives were worse. There are historians who take these claims at least partially seriously. After the liberation of France, Laval fled, first to Spain, then to Austria. He was extradited back to France and put on trial for treason and crimes against the state. The trial was chaotic. Laval himself argued that the proceedings were a sham, that he was being tried not for crimes, but for political reasons. He wasn't entirely wrong. The atmosphere was charged with vengeance. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On October 15, 1945, Pierre Laval was taken out to be shot by firing squad. But before the soldiers could fire, he swallowed a cyanide capsule he had somehow hidden. He survived, barely. Doctors pumped his stomach, and within hours he was carried back out, weak and barely conscious, and shot. Even today, the Laval case remains one of France's most morally complex post-war chapters. Was he a traitor who deserved death? Was he a cynical pragmatist who did what he had to do? Or was he a man who genuinely chose collaboration and paid for it? History has not been kind. Number 9. Imre Nagy, Hungary, 1958. This next story is one that I find genuinely heartbreaking. Because Imre Nagy was not a tyrant, he was not a war criminal, he was not a collaborator. He was a man who believed in something and was hanged for it. Imre Nagy was a Hungarian communist politician who became prime minister in 1953, then again in 1956. He was a reformer within the communist system, someone who believed that socialism could be humane, that it could include elements of democratic governance, that the Soviet model of rigid totalitarian control was not the only path. And in October 1956, something extraordinary happened. A popular uprising erupted in Budapest. Hungarian citizens, fed up with Soviet domination, with political repression, with economic hardship, took to the streets. Imre Nagy aligned himself with the revolution. He announced that Hungary would leave the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet military alliance. He called for free elections. He appealed to the United Nations for support. For a few days, it seemed like it might actually work. And then, on November 4th, 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest. The uprising was crushed. Thousands were killed. Nagy sought refuge in the Yugoslav embassy. He was eventually lured out under a promise of safe passage. It was a lie. He was arrested, taken to Romania, and held in secret detention for almost 2 years. A secret trial was held in 1958. No public announcement, no international observers. He was found guilty of treason. On June 16, 1958, Imre Nagy was hanged. The secrecy of his execution meant that the world did not know for sure he was dead until the Hungarian government announced it, days later, almost as an afterthought. He was buried in an unmarked grave. But history does not forget. On June 16, 1989, exactly 31 years after his execution, Imre Nagy was given a state funeral in Heroes Square in Budapest. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarians turned out to honor him. It was one of the defining moments of Hungary's transition away from communist rule. He was rehabilitated, honored, remembered, but he was still dead. Do you think history ever truly corrects these kinds of wrongs? Number 10. Maurice Bishop, Grenada, 1983. And finally, we end with a story that is less well known than many on this list, but no less significant. Maurice Bishop was the Prime Minister of Grenada, a tiny Caribbean island nation with a population of barely 100,000 people. He came to power in 1979 through a coup, leading a left-wing revolutionary government that aligned itself with Cuba and the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. He was charismatic, visionary, and deeply beloved by many Grenadians. He built schools and hospitals. He championed literacy. He was the kind of leader who connected directly with ordinary people, warm, accessible, almost unlike the other figures on this list. But here's where things start to shift. Within his own movement, tensions were building. Bishop's deputy, Bernard Courtyard, along with a faction of hardliners within the New Jewel movement, believed that Bishop was too soft, not revolutionary enough. They demanded a power-sharing arrangement. Bishop refused. In October 1983, Bishop was placed under house arrest by his own comrades. On October 19, 1983, his supporters freed him and marched with him to Fort Rupert, the military headquarters. And then it all collapsed. military units loyal to Cord arrived. A confrontation escalated, and Bishop, along with several of his ministers, was lined up against a wall and shot. Maurice Bishop, the Prime Minister of Grenada, was executed by members of his own revolutionary government. The shock rippled through the Caribbean and the world. Days later, the United States, citing the chaos and the presence of Cuban construction workers building an airstrip, invaded Grenada in a military operation. Cord and the other conspirators were eventually arrested, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. Maurice Bishop was 39 years old when he was killed. Even today, his story is remembered in Grenada with genuine sorrow. He is honored as a hero, a leader who was not brought down by an external enemy, but by the very movement he had built. That is perhaps the most tragic ending of all. So there you have it. 10 leaders, 10 stories, 10 reminders that power, no matter how absolute, no matter how long it lasts, no matter how untouchable it seems, is always temporary. Saddam Hussein, who ruled Iraq for decades through fear and force, was pulled from a hole in the ground and hanged. Ceaușescu, who had built an entire cult around himself, was executed in a courtyard on Christmas Day after a 2-hour trial. Tojo, who had directed a war across the entire Pacific, was brought back from the brink of death specifically so he could face justice, and then hanged. Mussolini, the man who invented fascism, was shot by partisans and hung upside down in a public square. Jang Song-tek, the second most powerful man in North Korea, was erased from existence within days. Bhutto, a democratically elected leader, was hanged by the military he had trusted. Menderes, a popular prime minister, was executed and then, decades later, honored as a martyr. Laval, a collaborator, was barely conscious when the firing squad finally fired. Imre Nagy, a man who dared to believe in freedom, was hanged in secret and buried without a name on his grave. And Maurice Bishop, a revolutionary who inspired his people, was shot by his own comrades. These are not just history lessons. These are warnings. Power doesn't always protect you. Sometimes, it's exactly what leads to your downfall. The higher you climb, the further there is to fall. And the decisions made at the top, the compromises, the enemies made, the lines crossed, they don't disappear. They compound, they accumulate, and eventually they come due. Some of these men were monsters. Some were victims of deeply unjust political systems. And some exist somewhere in between, in the complicated, morally gray territory that history is so often made of. Which brings me to the only real question worth asking after all of this. Were these leaders victims of circumstance, or were they architects of their own fate? I genuinely don't think there's a single answer, and that's what makes these stories so endlessly fascinating and so endlessly troubling. Tell me which story shocked you the most. Tell me which execution you think was justified and which ones you think were something closer to murder. Because the line between justice and revenge is never as clear as we want it to be. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. These are heavy stories, and I appreciate you sitting with them.